Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we are exploring a single document. It's called Without, and it's an excerpt from a book about lynching photography, specifically a chapter titled Hellhounds.
Yeah,
I know this is a sensitive subject,
it is.
but I think it's so important to understand this part of American history, even the parts that make us uncomfortable.
You're absolutely right. In this chapter, it's at such a chilling tone right from the start.
Oh, yeah.
With that quote from bluesman Robert Johnson,
Yeah.
"You got to keep moving. There's a hellhound on my trail." It really encapsulates that feeling of terror that so many Black people in the South lived with every day.
It does. Yeah, it gets right to the heart of it. And
Yeah.
the document brings that feeling to life with a particularly horrifying story. The lynching of Sam Howes in Georgia, 1899. What stands out to you about this case?
I think the sheer spectacle of it.
Mm.
Over 2,000 people gathered to watch this man be tortured and murdered.
Wow.
Some even traveled on an excursion train, specifically for the event.
An excursion train.
An excursion train for a lynching.
Oh, my
It
God.
shows how deeply ingrained this kind of violence was
Yeah.
in the culture at the time.
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it? The document mentions that no one even tried to hide their faces. It's like they weren't even considering that what they were doing was wrong. And the media at the time played a huge role in fueling this frenzy.
Absolutely. Newspapers painted Sam House as a monster,
Yeah.
claiming he murdered his employer and raped his wife, justifying the violence that was to come.
Right.
Later, investigative journalists like Ida B. Wells revealed the truth, that House had acted in self-defense after being threatened. He never even entered the house, let alone assaulted the man's wife.
It's a chilling example of how easily misinformation could be used to incite violence and how little value was placed on a Black man's life. The document goes into some pretty graphic detail about the torture Hose endured. They cut off his ears, fingers, genitals, they skinned his face. It's hard to even comprehend that level of cruelty.
Right. It is. And what's even more disturbing is the way the document describes the crowd, fighting over pieces of his heart and liver as souvenirs.
Really?
Someone even tried to deliver a piece of his heart to the governor.
Oh my.
It's like they viewed him not as a human being, but as some kind of trophy.
That makes you think about how the chapter talks about lynching being almost like a ritual, a performance
Right.
with its own vocabulary and imagery. I mean, calling it a Negro barbecue just adds another layer of dehumanization to the whole thing.
Yeah, you're right. It's almost as though they were trying to make it festive,
Right.
a community event.
The community of...
This wasn't just mob violence. It was a carefully orchestrated performance of white supremacy.
Wow.
And the photographs and postcards that were made from these lynchings served as a way to further spread and commemorate this terror.
It's mind-boggling. Can you imagine receiving a postcard in the mail with a photo of a lynching? The document actually mentions a Unitarian minister in New York who received one, along with a note promising more to come.
It just shows how pervasive this violence was, how it permeated every level of society.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't happening in some dark corner. It was out in the open,
Mm-hmm.
accepted, even celebrated.
Yeah.
And this was all happening just a few decades after emancipation. It makes you question what freedom really meant for Black people in the South.
It does. This surge in lynching during this period, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it didn't happen in a vacuum. The document connects it to the rise of the new Negro and the anxieties that came with Black progress. Can you expand on that a bit?
Of course. As Black people began to gain a foothold economically and socially, there was a backlash from segments of white society who wanted to maintain white dominance.
Right.
Lynching became a tool of terror, a way to enforce white supremacy and put Black people back in what they perceived as their place.
So it wasn't just random violence. It was a deliberate message designed to instill fear and suppress Black advancement. The document mentions that an estimated 4,742 Black people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. That's an average of 2 to 3 Black Southerners murdered every week for decades. It's just staggering.
And those are just the documented cases. The true number is likely much higher. It wasn't just hanging either. The document is very graphic in its descriptions of the torture, mutilation that were common, burning, shooting, dismemberment. It's truly horrific.
I was particularly disturbed by the story of Mary Turner, who was 8 months pregnant when she was lynched, and her unborn child killed. Her only crime was vowing to seek justice for her husband's murder. It makes you wonder how people could justify such brutality.
It is hard to fathom. but the document does shed light on the twisted logic used to justify these atrocities. They would draw distinctions between good and bad lynchings,
Wiley.
with a good lynching being quick and efficient, while a bad lynching involved prolonged torture and spectacle. It's a chilling insight into their mindset.
It's like they were trying to create a hierarchy of violence, almost like there were rules to this barbarity. The document also mentions the pervasive use of the myth of the black rapist as a justification for violence.
That's a crucial point. By perpetuating this myth and playing on white fears and prejudices, they were able to frame lynching as a necessary evil to protect white women.
Right.
Of course, this completely ignored the reality of white sexual violence against black women, which was rarely acknowledged or punished.
It's a classic example of hypocrisy and double standards. The document also highlights how many lynchings weren't even related to sexual assault at all. They were often triggered by minor infractions, perceived disrespect, or any action that challenged white authority.
Exactly. Things like using disrespectful language, not stepping aside for a white person on the sidewalk, or even acting too uppity. It's a stark reminder of how arbitrary and capricious this violence was, and the complicity of law enforcement, government officials, and even some white churches allowed it to continue unchecked.
The document gives examples of coroner's inquests, routinely concluding that black victims had died at the hands of parties unknown. Even when everyone knew who the perpetrators were, it was a blatant attempt to protect white supremacy and deny justice to black victims.
You're absolutely right. It shows how deeply racism was ingrained in the institutions of the South. It wasn't just about individuals acting out of hate. It was a system designed to maintain white power and control.
But in the face of this horrific violence, the document also highlights black resistance and resilience. I was struck by Frederick Douglass's argument that lynching might actually be a favorable symptom of black progress. What do you make of that?
That's a really interesting perspective. Douglass saw it as a sign that black people were no longer passively accepting their oppression.
Oh.
They were pushing back, challenging the status quo, and provoking a violent reaction from those determined to maintain the old order.
So in a way, it was a sign that things were changing. The black people were refusing to be silenced or subjugated.
Exactly. And the document goes on to explore the many ways black people resisted this system of oppression.
Okay.
From forming their own communities and institutions, to developing strategies for navigating a hostile white world.
It's an important reminder that even in the face of such terror, there was always hope. There was always resistance. And I think that's something we'll delve into further in the second part of our deep dive.
It's easy to get caught up, in the brutality and focus solely on the victimization. But what's equally important, I think, is recognizing the agency, the strength, the ways black communities persevered despite this constant threat.
You're right. This document isn't just a chronicle of suffering. It's also about survival. It talks about how black communities built their own worlds, creating spaces of support and cultural expression.
Exactly. They built their own schools, churches, businesses. These spaces were vital, offering not only a sense of community, but a refuge from the hostility of the outside world.
It makes me think about the phrase, making a way out of no way. They were denied opportunities, faced constant danger, yet they still found ways to thrive, to build something meaningful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And within those spaces, they developed strategies for dealing with the white world, strategies that were as clever as they were heartbreaking. The document refers to it as wearing the mask, this idea of constantly having to adjust your behavior, depending on who you were interacting with.
It's exhausting just thinking about it, to always be on guard, to never truly be yourself. There's a quote from a black man in Louisiana that really resonated with me. He called it a pragmatic resignation to reality.
Such a powerful phrase.
Yeah.
It captures that blend of acceptance and defiance. They understood the rules of the game, but they refused to let it break their spirit.
The document shares the story of Ned Cobb, a tenant farmer in Alabama. He talks about learning to humble down and play shut-mouthed, to take every kind of insult in order to survive.
But even Ned Cobb, who was willing to play along to a certain extent, had his limits. He refused to completely surrender his dignity, to become, as he put it, a white man's nigger.
And that refusal, that insistence on maintaining a sense of self-worth, ultimately landed him in prison. It's tragically ironic how even the most skillful navigation of this system could backfire in such devastating ways.
It really highlights how the deck was stacked against them. But we can't forget that these lynchings weren't just about punishing individuals. They were also about sending a message to the entire black community.
You're right. It was about creating an atmosphere of fear, a constant reminder of who held the power. Step out of line, and this could be you. And what's so unsettling is how this message was reinforced, not just by mobs, but by institutions.
Precisely. We're talking about the media, the legal system,
Yeah.
academia. All of them contributed to a narrative of black inferiority, a narrative used to justify the violence that was meant to uphold white supremacy.
The document even mentions how historians and scientists played a role, offering up so-called scientific explanations for black degeneracy. It's chilling to see how supposedly objective fields of knowledge were used to prop up such racist power structures.
It speaks to how pervasive and insidious racism was, that it could be woven into the very fabric of society, even into supposedly neutral disciplines. And we can't forget the impact of popular culture. The document talks about how minstrel shows and films like Birth of a Nation spread racist stereotypes and helped to normalize violence against black people.
It makes you realize that these weren't just harmless forms of entertainment, they were shaping public perception and perpetuating harmful ideas that had real-world consequences. And these attitudes, this system of oppression, it didn't just vanish overnight. The document points out that lynchings continued well into the 20th century.
It's a sobering reminder that progress isn't linear. We see this in the horrific cases of Emmett Till in 1955 and Mike Charles Parker in 1959. It shows how deeply rooted these racial tensions were and how resistant some segments of white society were to change.
And even when lynchings became less frequent, other forms of violence and injustice took their place. The legal system, for example, continued to be used as a weapon against black people.
Absolutely. They were often denied fair trials, received harsher sentences, and even faced extrajudicial killings by police who acted with impunity. It was a different form of terror, but terror nonetheless.
It's like that line from the poem quoted in the document. We get the justice in the end, and they come by tens. A chilling reminder of the unequal application of the law, how black lives were consistently devalued.
Which brings us to a critical point. The fight against lynching was fundamentally intertwined with the broader struggle for civil rights. It was about dismantling the entire system of white supremacy that infected every level of society.
That makes a lot of sense. The document mentions how the fight was waged on multiple fronts, both legally and socially.
Exactly. There was the legal battle, with organizations like the NAACP pushing for anti-lynching legislation, and then there was the tireless work of activists like Ida B. Wells, who documented the horrors, exposed the lies, and galvanized public opinion against lynching.
It wasn't just about changing laws, though. It was about changing hearts and minds. That's where groups like the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching came in. They challenged the narratives that justified violence and appealed to the conscience of white Southerners.
And that was incredibly brave and risky work, but absolutely crucial to creating lasting change. And even though federal anti-lynching legislation ultimately failed to pass, the decades of effort by these activists weren't in vain.
They helped shift public opinion, raise awareness, and lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades to come.
You're right, and the story doesn't end there. This struggle for equality continues to this day. And it's interesting how the document, brings in the global perspective. It talks about how the rise of the United States as a global power, after World War II, really put a spotlight on America's racial injustices.
Yeah, I can see how that would be problematic, especially during the Cold War.
Exactly. The Soviet Union was quick to capitalize on this, using America's racial issues as propaganda, that international pressure. It forced the U.S. government to at least start addressing racism, even if it was more for appearances than genuine change.
So the fight for racial justice at home was playing out against this larger geopolitical backdrop. That's fascinating. And what about the black veterans who had fought for freedom abroad, only to return home to face discrimination?
That was a turning point. These veterans had risked their lives for their country, yet they were denied basic rights and dignity upon their return. Their frustration and anger, it fueled a new wave of activism.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the disillusionment they must have felt. They were willing to die for their country, but their country wasn't willing to guarantee them basic freedoms.
And the document mentions how, black people were starting to believe that things could be different, that the old ways didn't have to continue. They were no longer willing to accept the status quo.
And that shift in mindset led to some of the most significant moments in the fight for civil rights.
It did. Boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives. Black people put their lives on the line, facing down police brutality and white resistance to demand equality.
It was a long and arduous struggle.
It was. But it ultimately led to significant legal and social changes. The desegregation of schools and public spaces, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act.
It's a testament to the courage and determination of countless individuals who fought for a better future. But as inspiring as these victories are, the document makes it clear that the legacy of lynching, the legacy of racial violence and injustice, hasn't disappeared.
That's the hard truth. The issues raised by these photographs and stories are still relevant today. The fight for racial justice is far from over.
It makes this document feel so timely, so urgent.
It does. It forces us to confront a painful past, to acknowledge its ongoing impact, and to ask ourselves, what can we do to build a more just and equitable society?
It's not about dwelling on the horrors of the past, but about understanding how they continue to shape the present.
Exactly. This deep dive into Without challenges us to look beyond individual acts of violence and recognize the systemic nature of racism. It compels us to confront the ways in which our society continues to devalue and marginalize Black lives.
Yeah, it's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in dismantling systems of oppression and creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
And that's the real power of Without. It doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes, but it pushes us to engage with this history, to understand its complexity, and to dedicate ourselves to the ongoing fight for a better world.
Well said. This has been a heavy but necessary conversation. We hope you found this deep dive into Without insightful and thought-provoking as you continue to learn and grow. We leave you with the question posed by the document itself. How do the images and stories in Without challenge us to confront the ongoing legacy of racial violence and injustice in America today? Thanks for joining us and